Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's Q&A with the National Quilter Circle. My name is Leah. I am your moderator for today. You can see Colleen over there. We'll give her a quick hi and introduce her officially in a moment. Just a few reminders from me first. So first, if you didn't join us last week for our Made with Love mini-series, you're going to want to check out the link in the description of today's video. There are a ton of free patterns, and all of the videos of the step-by-step demonstrations are available for replay as well. Colleen was with us. We had a lot of fun doing all of the projects and patterns. So if you did not get a chance to join us for that last week, please visit the link in the description and get in on the fun. Second thing, this is Q&A. So you want to bring your questions to Colleen, and she's going to answer them, but that means that you need to find the chat box. So that should be below your video player or the chat on Facebook and YouTube. And any question that you have for Colleen, quilting related, anything you want to pick her brain about, this is your time to drop those questions into the chat box. I do see a few of you have already started to put your questions in. We have a few newbies as well, Colleen, so some people new to quilting that are already here. So once you found that chat box, give us your questions, and Colleen is going to be answering them until we run out of time. So that being said, it's time to officially introduce her. She is Colleen Tauke. She's our quilting expert today, and I would love for you to start us off, Colleen, by giving us a brief intro to you. Tell us what you've been up to, and anything else that's on your mind before we start to get into some questions.
Well, thanks, Leah. My name is Colleen, like Leah said. I am a quilter. I started out as a garment sewer, and about 20 years ago, I converted to quilting and haven't looked back. So quilting is so much fun. You get to use so many colors, so many textures, so many patterns. Once you dive in, and welcome to those who are newbies. Every one of us started as a beginner at some point. So we welcome you to our community. We will share as much knowledge with you as possible. In the last week or so, between Facebook Lives and working on a challenge quilt we have called Valiant Stars, we did lesson 2 today. So if you had all missed out on that, go back into the files, find some video, and you can still join us for that quilt block challenge. But I traveled to Minneapolis to do some taping for some videos for National Quilt Circle and Craft CTUs. We use video at different levels of membership. So there's always those new things to learn. And we'd like to make little short videos to help you kind of pick up some new skills, put those tools into your toolbox, and then you can run with it at your pleasure and have fun creating new quilts.
All right, we have a couple hellos that have dropped into the chat box as well. We've got Mavis from South Africa joining us,
Yay!
Lisa from Wisconsin, Cherry from Baker City, Oregon, who's creating a memory quilt for a German exchange student. So we've got lots of people viewing. Please let us know where you're watching from. Let us know any projects that you're working on, in addition to questions that you have for Colleen. So welcome. Colleen, are you ready to start answering some questions?
Sure. It looks like we have people all over the place watching, so that's fun. I'd love to hear what you're working on, or what maybe something that's tripped you up, or you've heard of a product or a technique and you wonder, is it useful? Let's talk about it.
Yes. Lillian is in first here. So this is less of a question and more of just a conversation starter. So Lillian had asked about making long bias strips in one of our previous Q&As, and says that she has since found some tutorials. Some are better than others. Colleen, do you want to talk a little bit more about that long bias strip making and open up the comments with that?
Yep, no problem. When it comes to making bias strips, either for using for applique or if you're cutting bias binding strips, we use the same kind of technique, just a wider strip maybe for the binding. And there's of course, more than one way to do everything. You can come into the idea of creating a large square and cutting pieces off of that, or even off of yardage, cutting a 45-degree angle so that you have a true bias angle across those woven fibers. And if that's something new to you, think about the grid on your mat. We've got grain lines going either lengthwise and crosswise, but if we go at an absolute 45-degree angle across that, we call that a bias. And that way, if we're cutting strips that way, they have a little bit of give, a little bit of ease to them. Nice for using in applique to create stems and vines, because they have the ability to turn but yet lay flat when we have them on our background piece. Or if we are using it for binding, it can be used on a simple straightaway on the edges of a quilt. It has a little bit more strength when we have that cross grain on the outer fold. It can also be used, and always is used, when we have either a curve, like a wave on the edge of our scallop on the outside edge of our quilt, which is an intentional curve, or if we create kind of a curve that has an inside corner, so scallop along the edge. And we need that bias for that give, that ability to kind of flex on those curves. Or whenever you're doing something rounded, maybe a placemat or a hot pad that's circular or oval shaped, you need that bias to have that edge, to have some give to go around the edge for binding. So there are two ways of doing it that probably are the most popular, is to literally just open up fabric the old-fashioned way and cut a 45-degree angle all the way across the fabric. Now, it's not easy to do. You probably want to use a marking tool so that you don't just cut in and then have things move around and have it shift. A lot of times what I've done, and before I learned a short technique, is I would literally chalk line or pencil line that diagonal, so I knew that it was going nicely across the fabric, make that first cut, and then cut off segments off of that, so that I didn't have to worry after that first initial diagonal was fairly close as you can get it. Then you can then take your segments off of that. So if they're binding, then they're 2 1/4 inch. You would just then take 2 1/4 inch strips, using that diagonal as kind of your guideline for cutting additional strips. If it's off by a tiny bit, it won't matter because you're still close enough to that 45-degree angle. You do need to be very careful though, because that is a bias, that has a lot of give. So maybe before you actually make that cut, you want to go in and starch your fabric, or use a best press kind of fabric to kind of give the fabric some extra stability to hold the fibers in place as you're cutting. And you want to gently maneuver that, because with all that bias, it can get distorted and stretched out, which isn't really what we're going for at that point. Trying to keep those fibers very stable. There is a technique out there where you take, I have to think about how to demo this. Let me find a couple of, I find some spare triangle squares I have laying around. I'm sure, as all quilters, you have fabric laying around, right? Okay, these are very small. You would have to do this on a large scale in order to get, let's use the red ones, better contrast. You would take a square of fabric, and you can Google this, cutting bias from a square, as what they call a continuous bias. Okay, you're going to be taking the square, reforming it, putting it back, marking it, putting it back together, and then cutting, almost like, let's go back to the old days of a telephone cord where it kind of spirals, or a slinky kind of look. You're cutting spiral pieces off. So you're taking a square, you're cutting it on the diagonal, but then you're going to realign the pieces to create this parallelogram like this, and you're going to seam across here. Then you would take the entire thing and you're going to mark. You'll find better written out instructions online, I'm sure, but you're going to mark the width of the strips that you want to take off of this strip. Now I need to put a pin in here so I can pretend this is seamed together. I need to be able to manipulate it a little, but you would mark the lengthwise of that, the pieces you want. Then you're going to take the entire thing and you need to join these edges together. But if you do them, oh, I can't. It's going to make a tube like this is the idea, is that you're creating a tube. But you don't want to be a perfect tube, because if you did that and cut pieces off, they'd be rings. And how do I know this? Because I've done it wrong. So I can tell you, don't do that. You need to offset the marked lines by 1. So they're going to be offset a bit, so that when you start to cut, you're going to make that continuous cut like in a slinky or in an old-fashioned telephone cord, and cut the entire piece. Now, there are diagrams online. If you Google cutting continuous bias from a square, you will get diagrams and formulas that let you know how big your square needs to be, how many inches of bias strip that will produce. But know that in this process, you will end up having seams within your bias strips. And some of them will end up close together as you get closer to the areas where these are joined at. So you're going to have seams in that. So if you're using a fabric that has a very noticeable directional design or stripe, this may not be the best technique in those cases. So if in a solid fabric, you wouldn't hardly see the seams in there, that would work really well. In some cases, going back to cutting that long piece across a piece of fabric will be the direction you might want to go. You have to have more fabric in order to cut those diagonals. Even if you have half a yard, you don't need to go all the way across the width of fabric. Just make that 45-degree line and link your pieces together. The efficient thing about using the square is that you get a lot off of a small piece of fabric and it's continuous and it's already seamed together. By cutting strips, maybe off of a half-yard width, you're still going to have to seam your pieces together. So you need to be thinking about that. So there are a lot of pros and cons to both of the methods. I've used both at different times. So it basically comes down to, what are you most comfortable with? What can you reference? Can you remember the configuration for this? I think I remember seeing this on maybe it was a Iowa Public Television probably series where they did this, and I drew it out really fast, but then I didn't have the reference for how many inches that produced. And now you can simply Google it. So go in and search for cutting continuous bias from a square of fabric, and you can come up with the information on that, or go back to the traditional and just cut diagonal pieces, 45-degree angle, and seam them together. It's a little bit tricky when you get to the seaming part, but you can do it. You just have to think about the angle that they're going together at, because each of your ends are going to be funny shaped. So you may have to blunt cut them and get a nice 45-degree angle so that you join your strips together nicely. But there's always something new to learn in quilting.
All right, well, now that we're caught up on the long bias strips, let's follow on a bit. So Lillian says that her question now is about making long strips of prairie points.
Prairie points. Okay. Prairie points are actually, well, there are tools out there for making multiple pieces and cutting multiple sections of prairie points. Traditionally, prairie points would be made from a square of fabric. So let me see here. Let's talk about, and I've actually seen people do them differently. So I guess there may be an option out there, but traditionally, when I've done prairie points, I've taken a square of fabric. Now, the size you start with is going to change the size of the overall. So you may have to experiment a bit unless your pattern calls for a prairie point or you're just trying something new. You would take this to the iron and press it, and then press again, so that you actually have 4 layers of fabric there. That way, the only raw edges now are on the outside edge, and that would go on the outside edge of your quilt. Let's see, I don't have another fabric and another color that I can do a square real quick, but we can show how they are nested together, because prairie points are something that you kind of have to play with the spacing, and everyone has a different comfort zone if they're creating on their own. How close together to place those prairie points. I've done them myself on projects, and I've assisted quilters. I was long arm quilting an individual's quilt, and they were doing prairie points on their quilt, and I had some questions about it. So the outside edge of your quilt, let's say that this is our little quilt top, and we're placing the prairie points along the cut edge or the outer edge of our quilt, or whatever kind of project you're working on, if it's table runner or wall hanging, and that fold is to one side. Now you're going to place the next one in the same orientation as the first, but you're kind of nesting it inside of the first one. So these aren't the neatest prairie points in the world, but that way they overlap, and the amount of overlap is your call. It also makes a difference on how big your project is, how many you're going to put on each side. you're going to need to make sure that whatever you put on, say if it says square table topper, if it's actually square, that you have the same number of prairie points on every side so they're spaced evenly. And that's just an adjustment, sliding them. They can be overlapped really tight. And then a lot will show on the outside edge like this where the overlap is going to be, or they can just barely tuck one inside of the other near the edge of your quilt. Because these are going to be placed pointing toward the center as you baste them or stitch them in place, but then eventually they're actually going to be on the outer edge of your quilt like this. The thing with putting prairie points on the outside of a project is you have to hand stitch the backing fabric by placing that seam allowance in near the batting. You're going to flip it towards the center and you're going to hand stitch the back to close it up, because usually you don't want any stitching showing in the front. So there is going to be some hand stitching involved by doing prairie points on a quilt. Now, the other thing is to think about the corner as you approach it. Let me get a little better fold on this guy here. The corners are kind of those kind of things where you need to think about how you're going to intersect at the corner and how it's going to go around the corner, because this prairie point really can't hang off the end, because if you stitch here and here, how do you flip it out? You've
Colleen,
locked
I'm
him
sorry
down.
to interrupt you. Are you able
Yep.
to show that a little closer to your body? We have somebody
Okay.
that's using.
Oh, sorry, I am out just a little too far, aren't I? Okay, here we go.
Yes.
We'll try again. The prairie points, when you get near the corner, you want one of the angles to go into the corner. You don't want it out hanging off the edge of your quilt, because as you stitch this outer corner and then turn, you wouldn't be able to flip this outward. You would have him tacked down. So this angle of the prairie point needs to go into the corner of your quilt. And as you would have them nesting along here, and then you would start again on this side. So you create kind of a miter. So this edge of the next prairie point is going to snug up against the last one you placed, so that when you turn them, when you get them stitched in place, it will look like, let me see if we can make it look like this when you're finished. So it's going to make a squared off corner as it goes around your quilt. So think about that when you're placing those prairie points on your corners as you approach them. Sometimes when I've done mine, I've laid out my quilt top, I put a prairie point on both ends, and then I kind of work towards the center. It makes it a little bit easier, because then you can see, oh, I need to adjust a little here or there to get everyone spaced evenly across. So if you start on both ends and kind of work your way towards the center, it makes it a little bit easier maybe than to do that fine adjustment, so that you know you have the same number or you have an even spacing along one edge. And then just repeat that on the opposite edge. Once you have one figured out, you have the opposite ends already figured out. So have fun with the prairie points. They can be a variety of colors. I know I did one for a Halloween project, and I used all the scrappy oranges and blacks from my project on that outer edge, and it was just the most fun ever. So you can have a lot of fun creating that unusual edge with a lot of fun prints.
All right, let's move on to another technique here. Sarah is looking for some tips from you, Colleen, on how to do Y seams.
Y seams. We have videos for that. Y seams take a bit of thought and manipulation, so that I'm hoping that our admin can go in and find a link to a Y seam video that we have. I think we have at least 2 or 3 different ones possibly. I know I've done one. On Y seams, you really have to be thinking ahead of how to get into that section. I've good example on the quilt behind me, because Y seams are used when you're setting in angles like this or setting in angles like this. So it's kind of a dot-to-dot sewing. Now, the thing is that you're going to be sewing a section at a time. We're so used to going pivot and just keep going. But in something like this, where you're going to put 2 shapes together and you're going to have a funny intersection, you're going to sew up to within 1/4 inch of the edge of your fabric and stop. And break thread and take it out, and you have to reposition and start again 1/4 inch down from the cut edge to finish out the seam. So there's kind of a manipulation, and the cameras hopefully have caught that enough in our videos. So hopefully we can get Katie to drop in a link for Y seams. They do take a little bit of practice, but take a deep breath and you can do it. Just realize that it's not speed sewing. This is not creating strip sets. This is doing delicate work, but it's beautiful when it's done. So once you get the hang of it, of kind of visualizing where you need to start and stop, and then how to refold your pieces, you can create the most fabulous angles.
Well, as promised, Katie has dropped that link into the chat box. So if Sarah or anybody else viewing is interested in that, you could go ahead and click that link, preferably after this Q&A is done. Maybe hop right into some Y seams after this. All right, let's go to Oregon for our next question. This comes from Sandy. Sandy's a new quilter, has a question about borders. Specifically, Colleen, what advice do you have about how many borders to put on and how wide should they be?
Okay. This is an age-old question. When I've worked in quilt shops and when I've taught classes, that's always, people are like, well, how do I determine how many borders do I put on a quilt and where do I even start? The number of borders is really up to you. That's the biggest thing. You are the designer at that point. Patterns are suggestions, but you have the last say on what you put together. Now, something to think about, and I'm going to bring in our challenge quilt because it does have a border on it, and that can kind of add to our discussion here. Now, when I was first starting out, because we all start somewhere, trying to figure out the size of borders was an issue to me too. And I always looked at somebody and said, so what numbers do I even think about? One of the things you can do is to take notes from your quilt top and from your patchwork. In this case, these squares within this block are a 4-inch finished. That gives me an even number to work with. So something that's pleasing to the eye is math that goes together. So 4 is divisible into 2. So this is a 2-inch border. And then to mimic the shape within the quilt block, I went to 4 here. And see, these are numbers that go together. They're even on even number, and they're divisible by the size of the block, or the pieces or units within the patchwork. So that can be a direction to get an idea of where to go. Now, if you're working on a table runner, this might be way too big, way too much to go on a table runner. If your block is, you have 4-inch patches or units within your quilt, maybe that 2 inches is just enough to finish the outside, maybe 1 border on something small like that so that it doesn't overpower the entire project. If you're working on a bed-sized quilt, that's always the place where people go, can I just add more borders? Well, of course you can. The drop of the bed, so across the beds where we usually want to see our patchwork, the portion that drops off the edge is where quilters tend to get into, do I just add wider borders? Well, you can. That's one option. And with today's mattresses that are so thick, sometimes that's the answer, is just to increase the size of those borders because they're going to hang down out of view most of the time anyway. But if you want to divide up that, so in this case, maybe you might want to use a 2, a 4, and then maybe you go to an 8. But I don't think most of the time I would go past an 8-inch border. It's just a lot of heavy fabric without much interest on the outer edge. And an 8-inch border is about as wide as your ruler is going to help you cut also. So kind of 8 is kind of my stopping point. If you're using a block that has other dimensions that, like, you know, there's 3, 6, 9. Well, you can divide that. You can do, if there's a unit in there that's 3, you could do 1.5. Repeat the 3 and then maybe go to a 6. Multiples of those numbers up. So they're 1.5, 3, 6 that kind of go together in a set. So use that as a starting point. The other thing is to audition the fabrics. Lay out your quilt top, lay out those fabrics along the edge, kind of just revealing maybe the size that you want it to be, and decide if that complements the quilt or distracts from the quilt. Because sometimes we can go into fabrics that overpower the rest. Other times, maybe it's a floral print and everything in that floral is then somehow contained in the piecing and the patchwork. Well, you might want to have a wider border on something that's like a large floral so that you can see the detail of the floral or a stripe or some other larger scale print. So sometimes the fabric itself kind of tells you, I want to be the show. I want to be the center of attention here, and everything else is going to complement me. So there are kind of a lot of different directions to go when it comes to selecting borders. But the biggest thing is to lay it out, audition, and see how it complements the center of your quilt. Sometimes you think, oh, I know I want to have this bright yellow and a lime green and then something else. And then when you lay it out, that line is all you see. That lime green maybe is just too electric and it distracts from everything else. So maybe he either has to be a smaller border, or maybe he just needs to go away and let the other two fabrics or what other choices be the border of your quilt. So it's very much a quilter's discretion to decide borders, but think of the math within your quilt and then audition that to see what effect it causes. Even take a picture of it. Maybe even you think you're going to finish today and you get to that point and you're not sure. Take a picture, sleep on it, come back tomorrow and see what it says to you. Because sometimes when we pop back in to look at that picture, it's all of a sudden says, yeah, I'm it. Or sometimes it says, maybe not. And the other thing is, go talk to someone in a local quilt shop. You can always ask for advice there too. They're a great resource on directions to go to help you finish your quilt.
All right. I really like that taking a picture tip. That is fantastic. Mm-hmm. Gives you a little something to come back to after you've thought about it for a while.
Exactly.
All right. Let's do Sue's question next. Sue wants to know if you can use a double needle to quilt a quilt.
Double needle. I don't think I've ever used a double needle in the quilting process. Huh. That's a good question. And I do know that double needles come in different widths. So there's, spacing between them. Mm-hmm. It depends, I suppose, on the type of quilting you want to do. If you were wanting to do like a twin needle crosshatch, that would be a fabulous use of a twin needle. Oh. But do know that when you're using a twin needle, what happens to the bobbin? Because you only have one bobbin thread there. So that means that that bobbin gets shared back and forth between those stitches. So it may look good on the top, but double check to see what the back is going to look like, because your bobbin thread is going to make kind of a zigzag on the back side of your quilt. So that's something to take into consideration.
All right. Well, Sue, if you give it a try, let us know how it goes the next time around. Yep. All right. We're going to username Doo-Wop for our next question. So the question is, making a folded pinwheel quilt with many layers of fabric on a finished block, 5 to 6 layers, and doubled sewing blocks together. What can I do for borders of 1 layer fabric? Maybe quilt as you go using batting, fusing on the border fabric? What do you think, Colleen?
Okay. Yeah, those thicknesses are going to be kind of an issue. The quilt as you go might be your best bet, because you can work with sections at a time where you don't have to have all that bulk of everything kind of rolled up that you're moving through the machine. If folded pinwheels, usually those are kind of textured, I believe, a kind of a 3D kind of application, I should say. I don't know if I would add an interfacing layer to it. That's going to make it even heavier and stiffer. I would experiment with the quilt as you go kind of project finishing, because at least it lets you manipulate small portions of that under the machine to put the layers together. You're going to want to make sure that those folded pinwheels, aren't bothered or bumped into as you quilt the other portions of the quilt top, unless those are tacked down at some point. So a little bit of experimenting might be the best course of action. It's not something I've done before. I've I've seen similar things done. A friend of mine had done, I don't know if you would call them a folded pinwheel, but they were a 3D kind of application where those pedal or a 3D, the folded triangles like that were kind of pulled back as petals. And I know she was very careful when she was quilting that. It was a large quilt at the time. She had sashing in between her blocks, if I remember right. It was kind of on a lattice work. So a single layer of sashing between, which is kind of similar to what you would do if you were doing quilt as you go. So if quilt as you go is kind of a technique you enjoy, I would go that direction. Otherwise, you can simply put a single layer sashing between your blocks and just progress as any other quilt. Just take very extreme caution when you're quilting.
All right, best of luck. I hope that goes really well for you. Let's go to Connecticut for our next question here. This one comes in from Vicky. Vicky says, I'm having a problem getting an accurate scant 1/4 inch. Colleen, do you have suggestions or tips so that she can get a hang of that?
That's something that all of us as quilters just, you work and work and work until you finally get it. And then for some reason, it's like a light bulb goes on in your head. It's kind of like a toddler who figures out that there's a word for everything on the planet and they start to name everything. Something that I usually did in beginner's class or novice level class was to take a simple recipe card with the blue lines on it. The blue lines are exactly a 1/4 inch apart. They're the kind of the scant 1/4. So what I would have beginners do is put this under their machine and drop the needle into one of the blue lines and then try to figure where the next blue line to the right falls. If it's right along the edge of your presser foot, if it's just barely under the edge of that presser foot, those are things to look for. Or you can purchase a 1/4 inch foot for your machine. And I'm not sure if I have mine handy close by right offhand. The presser foot that is made for the 1/4 inch, there are 2 different kinds. Now on a regular presser foot that kind of a utility one that I have on, the 1/4 inch foot has a blade, kind of a bumper along one edge to the right of the needle, kind of like bumper bowling. So it has a little flange on the side that you put your fabric up next to, not jammed in too tight, but just next to it. And that will help you get your 1/4 inch accurate. Or there is a foot that narrows in the front and it has kind of 2 little teeth that come out the front, then that's a 1/4 inch there. Some of those come along with machines. Other times people have to purchase a separate 1/4 inch foot for their machine. If that's not a possibility, then you can, like I said, use the recipe card with the blue lines and figure out where the cut edge of your fabric needs to fall for it to be an accurate 1/4 inch seam. For years, I mean, before I had these machines, I had a Kenmore 8-stitch, I think, and it was such a basic machine. I got it for high school graduation from my parents. I just simply put a piece of painter's tape along the edge, exactly where that blue line on my little recipe card from my instructor told me that where my cut edge needed to be, and I had a piece of tape across my machine, the bed of my machine, for years. After a while, it becomes second nature. But at first, it seems like you're almost kind of walking a tightrope to get the 1/4 inch seam, especially if you come to quilting from a garment sewing background. You go from a 5/8 inch seam allowance down to a 1/4, and that seems so tiny at first. But when they say scant 1/4, it means right at a 1/4 or just one thread to the side of that 1/4 inch line. So close is really great. There are techniques, as I was showing this morning in Valiant Stars, we were oversizing our blocks just a tiny bit and then trimming them to be exact. That way our 1/4 inch, if it happens to vary just a tiny bit, our blocks can be trimmed to the perfect size and not waste a lot of fabric, but not everyone likes to do that process. So practice that 1/4 inch. Go get that recipe card, drop the needle in one blue line, look directly to the right, that's a 1/4 inch. So then even if you have to take the thread out of your sewing machine and drive that line so you're watching a 1/4 inch just by putting holes in the paper without thread in your machine, and you'll get that 1/4 inch down. I know there were even times when I first began that I actually went in and drew a line for myself just because I thought I knew what a 1/4 inch looked like. And then when I went to measure my pieces, yeah, my 1/4 was more like a 3/8 inch seam allowance, and nothing wanted to fit together. So I would actually go in and sometimes draw a little tiny pencil line for myself to follow. And that kind of gave me the training wheels and the confidence to start to see what that 1/4 inch really looks like. So happy quilting. You can do this. Practice makes perfect.
All right, we're going to go back to the edge of a quilt for our next question. This one comes from Miriam. And Miriam is wondering about wrapping the backing fabric to the front to make a frame on the front of the quilt. Does that work okay? What are your thoughts on that, Colleen?
Yep, it can be done. You will hear different opinions from different quilters. Some like it, some don't. Some have no opinion. Imagine that. It is one way to finish a quilt. I know it's the way that my grandmother even finished the quilt that that she gave me when I was a kid. She didn't probably even know what binding was. And so by taking her quilt top and whatever layer in between, or if it was a blanket or a batting, and her backing fabric, she rolled the fabric to the front and finished it that way. And that's an acceptable method. Do know that then you just have one layer of fabric coming around that edge, which means that it doesn't wear quite as well as when you use what we call French fold binding, which is a strip that's folded in half. So you have extra layers there for strength along that outer edge. But done is good. A quilt top that's not finished is not useful. So if this is how you need to finish the quilt, do so. When you do that, you'll have to plan ahead how wide you want that piece to wrap around to the front. You will want to trim away any excess batting and probably fairly close to the cut edge of your quilt, unless you want a wider kind of almost a border kind of effect on there. Then you would want to leave the batting longer. So a little planning and a little bit of math and measuring is going to come into effect here. But if you were taking it right up to the edge of your quilt top, you're going to want to turn under the outer edge about a 1/4 inch, something so that you've got it turned to have a finished edge there. So you're going to take that backing and you're going to turn that outer edge all the way around your quilt backing. And if you want to create, well, there's 2 ways to do the corner. You can either fold one side in and then the second side in and make kind of a boxed corner, so that you just turn one side first and then the second and stitch. Or you can do a miter. A miter takes just a little bit more time and a little bit of thought, but you're going to bring that fabric at a make a triangle effect. You're pulling it about as far as the tip of your quilt top, or however far you want to overlap it. And then you're going to be folding in from each side to create that angle, that miter that goes into the corner. Now, that piece that you fold in, you may need to trim that point because it's a little longer than needs be. It'll show otherwise. If you want it tucked away inside, you're going to bring this in, iron that at a 45-degree angle, then one side and then the other side. Of course, you're going to have this folded to finish here. You're going to want to go back and stitch that miter closed by hand or even by machine. You can stitch into it with your machine, cross over and come back out. But you're going to want to stitch that down because otherwise it's kind of what we in the quilt world call a toe catcher, a place where you could catch a finger or a toe and rip something. So you're going to want to secure that. But my grandmother did the simple turn one side and then turn the other. And, she stitched off one side, turned the other, came back and stitched this way. So, as long as quilts are done and loved, that's all that counts. We can work on techniques and skills an entire lifetime to create different ways of finishing the outer edges of our quilts. So good luck.
All right, right before I get into our next question, just a quick reminder from me. We are not at the end of our time, but we are getting close enough that if you are hanging on to a question and you haven't dropped it into the chat box yet, now is the time to do so. We're going to get to as many as we can before we have to say farewell, but I wanted to get that reminder in before our next question. And our next question comes from Frida. So Frida is looking for some tips on getting the perfect flying geese. There are so many different methods. Colleen, what do you have in terms of suggestions, or do you have a favorite method?
Wow. Because flying geese, yes, they can be made traditionally. You could go back to the traditional way of cutting a quarter square triangle and 2 half square triangles and putting those together. That would be the basic bare bones how to make a flying geese unit. But most of us probably wouldn't go that direction because there are so many faster techniques out there nowadays. I know when I started quilting, I started with a rectangle of fabric and 2 squares, did the diagonal seams, flipping those out to make that flying geese units. Except that my flying geese units kind of always had kind of a bend in them from distortion. And I pretty much have landed on the flying geese 4 at a time method. So you can, I'm pretty sure we probably also have a video for that. I'm sure someone's probably made one. Or you can just go into Google for video and find the flying geese 4 at a time, or even the instructions printed out for you on how to do those. The flying geese 4 at a time are probably the most efficient way to create them. So you're working with 1 large square and 4 small squares. I don't know who the brainchild was who thought of the method, but it's ingenious and it doesn't waste any fabric. The kind where you take a rectangle and you put a square on each side, do your diagonal seams. You end up trimming off a triangle of fabric of both fabrics and throwing that away, and a triangle, 2 triangles over here and throwing that away. And it does waste a little bit of fabric. So when I ran across the 4 at a time method, doesn't waste any fabric. They seem to come out quite well. I think the reason why I like that method the best is that if you're doing it traditionally, in order to make 4 flying geese units, you would have to cut 4 triangles, and then you would have to cut 8 small squares. So you got 12 pieces to cut. And where does the error happen most often? It's in our cutting. There are a lot of places when you're cutting 12 pieces for a bit of error to happen on any of those sides. In the 4 at a time method, you're only cutting 5 pieces. That means you're reducing your error in cutting by at least half. So you have half as much chance of making an error there. And it seems that because you're leaving pieces larger as you make them, the flying geese 4 at a time, I think that I come out with more accuracy and less distortion. My pieces measure nicely. They don't seem to be as wonky. And I like the method. Actually, I'm trying to think. I was just writing a pattern last night that uses the flying geese 4 at a time method. And that project, trying to think, will come out in March on a Facebook Live. So if you're looking for a fun little, I don't know if I've settled on the name for it yet, but it's going to be a project for St. Patrick's Day. And Craftsy and National Quilt Circle will host that Facebook Live on a Tuesday. So be looking for look what's coming out, Facebook Live, and I will teach you that 4 at a time flying geese technique right here. So join me then.
All right, something to look forward to in the month of March. I love it. Okay, let's talk equipment next. This comes from Christy. Christy is looking for your tips, Colleen, on the best compact quilting machine to buy, specifically non-expensive if you can.
That's always the question, because money is a factor.
Yes.
Machines get expensive, and when it comes to taking them to class or traveling with them, these mooses are not fun to move around. So trying to think. Offhand, I can't give you absolute names of different brands, but I know that different brands do have some lighter weight machines that are a little smaller, easy to take to class. They will contain more plastic parts than they will metal parts. That's where the lightweight comes in. The inexpensive machines that you find at a big box store or the chains, they will work for a while, but you may have issues with tension and consistent stitch quality at times. I'm not saying anything bad about them. They just may not last as long as you're hoping for. So the biggest thing is to, if you can, get to your local quilt shop or a local dealer and actually try the machine. I'm sure we have how many quilters on here right now? Crowdsourcing. Give the name and the make of the model you like that's lightweight, that can be moved from place to place fairly easy. I do know I own a Viking machine. It's, of course, a version that's not made anymore, because as soon as you buy a machine, they come up with something new. It's an older model, Platinum 750. If it's a little bit lighter weight, it's easy to take to class. It has a consistent stitch quality to it. It was not an extremely inexpensive machine, but buying a machine on the secondary market can be the ticket. So if it's eBay, or not eBay maybe, but a swap place or a Facebook marketplace purchase, you may find a steal of a machine out there that someone has upgraded to a new machine, a bigger machine, and their smaller one that they don't want anymore, they're willing to part with it. You know the history on that machine, you know when it was serviced last, you know how much it's going to weigh, and for taking to class or moving around with it. That might be one of your best resources, because some of the better machines out there are the little bit older machines. If you go really old, then you can get into the featherweight machines, of course, that are teeny tiny and so cute and have the most amazing stitch quality you can find. But that might run you $300-400 still, even for those, and they're just going to do a straight stitch. So do some investigating. Hopefully some quilters here can give you names of different machines that they may take to class. I don't know hardly any quilter that only owns one sewing machine. So we have a lot of good resource right here. So please help us out.
Absolutely. Always crowdsource in the comments. That's part of why we love these Q&As as well. Joyce has a question here about foundation paper piecing. So Joyce has a foundation paper piecing pattern, and it calls for joining units using 90-degree angles. Joyce cannot find any specific directions on how to do this. So do you have any tips, anything to help her out for this?
Joining pieces of 90, that's a normal seam. That's a straight seam. I'm not sure if I'm understanding the question quite. I will go into the chat afterwards, and maybe she can give me a little bit more. Usually on foundation paper, we're creating wedges or sections or pieces, and then it will tell you the order to put those together in. But if you're talking about a 90-degree angle, it sounds like almost like it's a set inseam, so that you may have created a piece, things that come together like this, and you have to set something in. So it may be having you make a seam here and then stop and sew this direction in to set in a portion here. But maybe if she could share a picture or something in the chat later, I can help her out there, because I'm not exactly sure what the question is.
All right.
Sorry.
Joyce, if you have more to add, drop that in. Like Colleen said, she can take a look at this after we go. Let's move on then. We're actually going to move back a little bit. We're going to go back to the prairie points that you were talking about earlier. Sue is not quite understanding how to finish the prairie point edge. So you had mentioned that the backing edge has to be turned under. Sue wants to know then, how is this lined up at the top, the prairie point edge? Can you go over that again?
Yep. It turns into a kind of question, because the first time I did it too, it was like, oh, that's what I have to do. Okay. So let me recreate my prairie points here real quick on a temporary basis here. Now, if I'm attaching my prairie point to the outer edge of my quilt, when I'm finished with this, I'm going to be turning the prairie points have to extend out from the edge, correct? They're the showcase at the end of our quilt, or the edge of our quilt. So this is what we're trying to get to. So that means there's a seam allowance that's on the outside of our quilt is going to be turned toward the back side of our quilt. So this is our patchwork. This is the prairie point off the edge. Now on the back of the quilt, let's see if I can put a pin in this to hold it in place. We're going to pretend that one's stitched in place, and we even got a second one nested in here. It's amazing what you can do with a recipe card and a straight pin, right? Magic sewing. Okay, so now this is the back side of our quilt. And you cannot, when you put your prairie points on and you're quilting one of these, you can't quilt all the way to the outer edge of your quilt. You have to leave that backing. You can only quilt up to about within an inch of that outer edge. So then the backing fabric, we're going to pretend this is a backing fabric. The backing fabric needs to come out here, but then this cut edge needs to be turned under so that it can match up and sandwich and mimic that fold on the front so that it's finished like this. So that means you're going to take your backing fabric and turn it under all the way around the outer edge. And you're going to line it up because you're going to have a stitching line where you applied your prairie points. That's going to be the place that you're going to line up the fold of the backing fabric with that stitched line. And then you're going to, get in there. You're going to hand stitch along that fold on the back side of your prairie points so that it looks pretty, like it's inserted into the edge of your quilt miraculously. So you're going to take really tiny stitches, and that stitching line that you use to attach their prairie points is a nice, it's going to be a kind of a thick line of stitching, and that will give you kind of that anchor to stitch into. No different than if you were sewing the binding on your quilt. You know, when you go into the fold and then you go into your quilt for a stitch, you're going to go do the same exact thing on the back. Is you're going to go into that prairie point right along that stitching line, up into the fold of the backing, then back to the prairie point, then back up to the fold of your backing, and back and forth. Same way you would put binding on, except that you're going into the back side of that prairie point area there. So it is a little bit tricky, and that's why another reason why you can't get a prairie point off the end, because you have to have another piece that's going to be folded back along this edge for the next prairie point to come out. So, and when you're quilting, and I had machine quilted on my domestic machine, a small one, knowing that I couldn't quilt all the way to the outer edge when I was working on this. But when I got a big one on my long arm, I was like, oh, that's right. I have to leave space so that I can go in and manipulate that backing fabric and line it up and finish it on the back side. So those prairie points make that really pretty triangle finish, kind of showcasing the outer edge of my quilt. So I hope that helps to kind of clarify how you have to maneuver the backing fabric folded under to hand stitch along the back. Now, I guess if you are really good, there's a possibility you could fabric glue that in place and then stitch a certain distance on the front of your quilt, hoping to hit the back correctly. But I'm not that good at that. I tend to go back to the hand stitching part because I can hide my little stitches and get it really accurate that way. So it just takes a little time, but it's well worth the effect that you get when you're done.
Okay, it is that time. Our final question for today's Q&A, and it comes from Michelle. So Michelle wants to know, Colleen, what do you think is the best marker or pin for black fabric? Michelle's making a wedding ring quilt, so she needs a lot and she needs accuracy.
And this is for marking the quilting stitches? Does she say?
It doesn't say, but it just specifies that it's black fabric.
Black fabric. Okay. I would probably opt to go with, number one, I would not use a friction pen. No way. Don't friction pens anyway. They're marker. They would soak in on black. You wouldn't see it, but they would give you a ghost line. So you don't want to go that direction. What ghost lines means that once it's disappeared, sometimes they come back when the fabric gets cold. And so on the surface of fabric, we never want to use those on the right side, always on the back side of fabric. Now, if I am marking quilting lines on a black, I would opt for, and I have a couple of different ones here. That's what I was trying to locate. Here we go. Depending on your eyesight, you could use a Hera marker, which is basically just putting a groove on the fabric, but you have to have a really good lighting and really good eyes. So for me, I'm a little too old to use a Hera marker, but some of the young ones, they can see the shiny line left by rubbing this, so they could follow that. But if you're more like I am in this age group, not saying anything negative about it, it's just who we are at this point. These are the two that I would suggest. This one, actually both of these are made by Soline. There are other brands out there. Quilter Select, I believe, makes one, and off the top of my head, I'm not sure. There might be one more company that makes these. They have ceramic lead in them, and this one, though it's a green, it's a kind of a grass green, kind of coloring, green, kind of a, like I said, a ceramic, it's called ceramic marking tool. I don't know if it's going to pop up here now. There's a green line right through there.
A little bit.
It works. It works on dark colors. I can use this on navy blue. I can use it on chocolate brown, black, even super dark reds. The green works great on everything except green. So the green lead is great, but it also comes in white, yellow, pink. Sometimes I don't go towards pink. Anything red, we used to have a saying in our house, red, you're dead. So I kind of, nothing against the company. If they make pink, okay. But I just don't go there. But the yellow, the white, I would test out to see, number one, what you can see the best. The white may be it. It might be yellow. Another one is a chalk, and I'm trying to remember the exact name of this. It's a chalk kind of, a chalk liner. It makes a little bit wider line, and the line is there at the top, goes across. It's a little bit wider line. Cost-wise, this is maybe a little less expensive. I don't know how many, you can get replacement leads for them, so you just keep refilling them. But either one of these will make a nice, crisp line that doesn't smudge, because there are chalk liners out there that have a little wheel in the end of them, and they'll put down a chalk line, but if you put down too many lines at once, if you rub across them, they get smeary, and so you don't get that nice crisp line if you're trying to do maybe your hand quilting on the quilt you're working on. So something that will leave a line that's nice and crisp, these can be easily removed either with a brush or by misting, and they go away. So that's why I tend to go in this direction for marking on the right sides of fabric. So either one's by Soline or Quilter Select. So ceramic pencil is probably the direction to go. Stay away from lead pencil. Lead, I even use lead pencil on just a piece of, what is it called? Golden Treasures, or it's a tracing paper for a stitching. And I used a lead pencil on that, but it was on the paper layer on top of white. As I stitched down through it, the thread picked up the lead and carried it to the fabric, and I cannot wash it out. Lead pencil is really hard. Graphite does not remove from fabric well. Very, very hard to get out. So make sure that you're using a fabric approved kind of marking system, something that you can mist away or brush away. But the ceramic pencil, I think, would probably be the ticket for working on a dark background.
All right. Well, with that, we've reached the end of our questions. Colleen, I'd love for you to remind us where we could keep an eye out for you in the future, what you have in your planning before I send us off with a quick sign off. So let us know.
Okay. I am working on a quilt block challenge with Craftsy National Quilter Circle. We're doing Valiant Stars. That we are a little ways in, but the files are all there and the videos, or support videos are there. So if you haven't jumped in yet and you're looking for a new project, Valiant Stars, I come in and check in once a week and do a Facebook Live Next week's will be on Wednesday at 10 o'clock. So on Wednesday, we'll pop in and I'll give you the techniques and the tips for working on the next set of blocks there. Facebook Live is every other Tuesday. So we didn't do one this Tuesday, which means next week, which when I went to look at the date is 2/22/22. So lots of twos. So join me on Tuesday, 10 o'clock. We do Facebook Live every other week with a free downloadable pattern that you can enjoy watching us put together here. And then you can take the pattern and interpret any way you please.
And our team has dropped the link for that Valiant Stars Quilt Block Challenge. The Craftsy link is in the chat box as well. So if you want to join in on that, you can find the link there. Another quick reminder that the link in the description will take you to last week's Made with Love mini-series. There are 5 projects, 5 free patterns. We did some baking, we did some sewing, we did some weaving and crocheting last week. So if any of that interests you, you can go ahead to the link in the description and get those patterns as well. Other than that, it's time to say farewell, but not for long. We'll always be back with another Q&A. So please keep your eye out for the next one. We would love to see you there. On behalf of Colleen and our entire team, thank you so much for joining us today. And until we see you next time, happy quilting.